disrespectful American tourist mocked Britain's proud military history right in front of a royal guard, assuming he'd get no reaction. But then the guard uttered a single command, and in that moment, the tourist's smugness vanished. What followed wasn't just a response. It was a lesson in honor and respect. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's begin. The morning mist hung over the Thames like a shroud, carrying with it the weight of 1,000 years. The Tower of London stood as it always had, its ancient stones bearing witness to the rise and fall of empires, the execution of queens, and the countless souls who had passed through its gates. But on this particular Tuesday in September, it would witness something else entirely. Collision between ignorance and honor that would leave one man forever changed. Brad Hutchinson stepped off the tour bus with the swagger of a man who believed the world owed him something. At 42, he carried himself like someone who had never been told no in a way that mattered. His USA #1 tank top stretched across a belly that spoke of too many barbecues and not enough consequence. Behind him, his wife Sarah clutched her oversized purse and shot apologetic glances at the other tourists who had endured Brad's commentary during the 40-minute ride from their hotel. Finally, Brad announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the subtlety of a foghorn. "Let's see what all the fuss is about with this old pile of rocks." The warder stood at his post near the entrance to the White Tower, as motionless as the stones themselves. His Tudor uniform, with its distinctive red and gold threading, caught the pale morning light. The ceremonial halberd in his gloved hands seemed to grow from his very being, so still was his posture. To the casual observer, he might have appeared to be nothing more than an elaborate mannequin, a tourist attraction dressed up for the cameras. But beneath that bearskin hat, behind those steady eyes that stared straight ahead, was James William Thornton, aged 51, veteran of 3 tours of duty, holder of the Military Cross, and a man who had earned his place among these ancient walls through blood, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to something greater than himself. The other tourists maintained a respectful distance from the guard, understanding without being told that they were in the presence of something sacred. Children whispered to their parents, asking questions about the uniform, the history, the significance of it all. An elderly German couple stood in reverent silence, perhaps remembering their own country's complex relationship with the military traditions of Britain. But Brad saw none of this. He saw what he had been conditioned to see: a man playing dress-up, a living museum piece, a relic of an empire he had been taught to view as quaint and irrelevant. In his worldview, America had saved Britain twice in the 20th century, and now the former colony had far surpassed its former master in every way that mattered. "Hey, Sarah, get a picture of me with this guy," Brad called out, already moving toward the guard with his phone raised. "This is going to be hilarious. Wait till the guys back home see this." The guard's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, but something almost imperceptible shifted in his posture. His breathing, perhaps, became more controlled. His grip on the halberd, nearly undetectable, tightened by a fraction. Brad positioned himself next to the guard, making exaggerated poses while Sarah reluctantly took photos. "Come on, smile, buddy." Brad laughed, nudging the guard's elbow. "Lighten up, it's just a job, right?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was pregnant with the weight of centuries, filled with the ghosts of men who had stood similar watches, who had held similar lines, who had faced down enemies that would have made Brad soil himself at the very thought. "You know," Brad continued, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness, "back home, we don't need all this pomp and circumstance. We just get the job done. No fancy uniforms, no standing around like statues. Real men doing real work." A young British boy, perhaps 8 years old, tugged on his mother's coat. "Mummy, why is that man being so rude?" he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. His mother shushed him gently, but her eyes held the same question. The morning air grew thicker somehow, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Other tourists began to notice the scene unfolding, some pulling out their phones, others simply watching with the horrified fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents. Brad circled the guard like a predator sizing up prey, though he had no idea how thoroughly he had misread the situation. "I mean, seriously," he continued, his voice growing louder, more confident in his assumed superiority. "What do you guys even do anymore? Stand around looking pretty for the tourists? Hell, We could get a wax figure to do the same job, and probably do it better." The guard's breathing remained steady, but those who knew how to look, and there were a few in the crowd, could see the signs. The slight tension in the shoulders, the way his jaw set, almost imperceptibly, the manner in which his gaze, while still fixed ahead, seemed to sharpen to a razor's edge. James William Thornton was remembering. He was remembering the weight of a wounded comrade across his shoulders as mortar fell around them in Helmand Province. He was remembering the faces of the young Marines he had pulled from a burning vehicle, their dog tags reading Rodriguez and Kowalski, their blood mixing with his own as he dragged them to safety. He was remembering his grandfather's stories of Normandy, of Dunkirk, of standing shoulder to shoulder with American G.'s who bled the same red blood and died for the same cause. But more than anything, he was remembering why he stood here, in this uniform, at this post, on this day. It wasn't for the tourists, it wasn't for the ceremony, it was for the unbroken chain of duty that stretched back through generations of men who had worn similar uniforms, carried similar burdens, and paid similar prices. "You know what your problem is," Brad was saying now, stepping closer, his finger extended toward the guard's chest. "You live in the past. All this medieval stuff, all this royal garbage, it's over, buddy. The real world moved on. America moved on. Time for you guys to catch up." Sarah had stopped taking pictures. She could sense something changing in the crowd, something in the air itself that made her deeply uncomfortable. "Brad," she said quietly, "maybe we should." "Should what?" Brad snapped, turning toward his wife, but keeping one eye on the guard. "Should bow and scrape to some guy in a Halloween costume?" "I don't think so." The moment came, as such moments always do, with the inevitability of gravity. Brad reached out, his index finger extended, aiming for the center of the guard's chest, with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced real consequence for his actions. The movement was so fast that several tourists later swore they never saw it happen. One moment Brad's finger was moving toward the guard's chest. The next it was caught in an iron grip that stopped its progress as definitively as if it had struck a brick wall. The guard's hand had moved with the precision of a striking serpent, catching Brad's wrist in a hold that spoke of decades of training, of muscle memory built through repetition and refined through necessity. For the first time in their encounter, the guard's eyes moved, swiveling down to meet Brad's with a gaze that held depths the American tourist was utterly unprepared to encounter. "This uniform," the guard said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly, across the suddenly silent courtyard, stood at Waterloo when Wellington broke Napoleon's back. It held the line at the Somme when your great-grandfather was still in diapers. It walked the beaches of Normandy alongside your Marines, and it came home when many of them didn't. Brad tried to pull his wrist free, and found it as immovable as the tower stones. The grip wasn't painful yet, but it held the promise of pain. The suggestion that the man applying it could make things very uncomfortable very quickly if he chose to. I was just ... Brad stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist in the face of something real and immediate and potentially dangerous. "You were just what?" the guard asked, his voice still quiet, still controlled, but now carrying an edge that made Sarah take an involuntary step backward. "Just disrespecting men better than you, just mocking sacrifices you could never understand, just demonstrating the precise arrogance that makes the rest of the world wonder what happened to the Americans who once knew honor." The crowd had grown larger now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Phones were recording, but somehow, the atmosphere felt too solemn for social media, too weighted with history and consequence for casual entertainment. The guard continued, his grip on Brad's wrist never wavering, his eyes never leaving the American's face. "My grandfather wore this uniform at Normandy. Do you know what he told me about that day? He told me about an American boy from Iowa who threw himself on a grenade to save my grandfather's squad. 19 years old. Name was Thompson." Brad's face was beginning to pale, though whether from the pressure on his wrist or the pressure of the words, it was impossible to say. "Thompson didn't make it home to Iowa," the guard continued. "Neither did Rodriguez from Phoenix, or Kowalski from Detroit, or about 400,000 other American boys who died fighting alongside us. But you know what they did do? They earned our respect. They earned their place in our history. They earned the right to have their memory honored, not mocked by their own countrymen." The guard's free hand moved, slowly and deliberately, to the sleeve of his uniform. With the practiced motion of someone who had done this before, he rolled up the red fabric to reveal an arm marked by scar tissue, a puckered, angry flesh that spoke of fire and pain and healing that had taken months, if not years. Helmand Province, 2010, he said, his voice taking on a different quality now. Not softer exactly, but more personal, more immediate. IED took out a Humvee carrying 4 of your Marines. The vehicle caught fire. The doors were jammed. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Several tourists in the crowd stepped closer, drawn by the gravity of what they were witnessing. I pulled 2 of them out, the guard continued, his scarred arm still exposed. A testament written in flesh to sacrifice and brotherhood that transcended national boundaries. Rodriguez and Kowalski, 22 and 23 years old. Rodriguez had a picture of his daughter in his pocket. 3 years old, pigtails, gap-toothed, smile. Kowalski carried a letter from his mother that he read every night before sleep. The guard's eyes never left Brad's face, watching as the American tourist's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching comprehension. They lived, because I pulled them out. I carry these scars because they were Americans, and Americans once meant something to the world. Americans once stood for something worth bleeding for. Brad felt something fundamental shifting inside him, like a tectonic plate moving deep beneath the surface of his consciousness. The hand gripping his wrist belonged to a man who had shed blood for strangers, who had literally pulled American soldiers from fire, who had earned his scars in service of ideals that Brad had spent years mocking without ever understanding. The question is, the guard continued, what do you stand for? What would you bleed for? What would you die for? Because the men who wore this uniform before me, and the Americans who died beside them, they knew something worth more than comfort, more than convenience, more than the right to mock what they didn't understand. A young British boy had pushed to the front of the crowd, his eyes wide with something approaching awe. Without prompting, without instruction, he snapped to attention and delivered a crisp salute to the guard. The gesture was perfect, precise, filled with a respect that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere training. The guard acknowledged the salute with a slight nod, never releasing Brad's wrist, never breaking eye contact with the American tourist who was beginning to understand that he had stumbled into something far beyond his comprehension. My great-grandfather fought in the trenches of the Somme, the guard said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing a family history. My grandfather stormed the beaches of Normandy. My father served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. I've done 3 tours in Afghanistan. 5 generations of my family have worn uniforms in service of something greater than themselves. Brad tried to speak, tried to form words that might somehow undo the last few minutes, but found his throat dry and his tongue leaden. And you, the guard continued, you come here, to this place where men have died for ideas you mock, wearing a shirt that proclaims your country's superiority while demonstrating your personal inferiority. And you wonder why the world has stopped taking America seriously. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the distant sounds of London traffic seemed muted, as if the city itself was listening to this moment of reckoning. Slowly, deliberately, the guard released Brad's wrist. The American tourist flexed his fingers, working feeling back into them, but made no move to retreat. Something in his posture had changed. A subtle shift that suggested the bluster had been deflated, the arrogance punctured. I didn't, Brad began, then stopped, perhaps realizing that anything he might say would only make things worse. You didn't know that God finished for him. That's the problem, isn't it? You don't know your own history. You don't know what your grandfathers did, what they died for, what they believed in. You wear that shirt like a badge of honor, but honor isn't something you can buy at a gift shop. It's something you earn, something you prove, something you live up to. An elderly American veteran, identifiable by his VFW cap and the careful way he held himself, had worked his way to the front of the crowd. His eyes, sharp despite his age, moved between Brad and the guard, with the understanding of someone who had seen both the best and worst of human nature. Son, the veteran said quietly, addressing Brad, you're embarrassing your country. The words hit Brad like a physical blow. He looked around the crowd, seeing for the first time the expressions on the faces surrounding him. Not anger, exactly, but disappointment, pity, the look people give to someone who has revealed himself to be smaller than anyone hoped. The guard rolled down his sleeve, covering the scars but not their meaning. This uniform represents an unbroken chain of service that stretches back 800 years, he said. Men who died at Agincourt, who held the line at Waterloo, who charged at Balaclava, who went over the top at the Somme. They died for ideas, for principles, for something larger than their own comfort. A group of British schoolchildren had arrived with their teacher, part of a planned educational visit. They stood at the edge of the crowd, sensing that something important was happening but not quite understanding what. Those children, the guard said, nodding toward them, they'll learn about the men who wore this uniform. They'll learn about sacrifice and duty and honor. They'll learn that some things are worth more than personal convenience. The question is, what will American children learn from examples like yours? Brad looked at the children, really looked at them for the first time since arriving. They were watching him with the frank curiosity of youth, their eyes holding questions he wasn't sure he could answer. What did he represent to them? What story would they tell about the American tourist who had mocked their guard? My son, Brad said quietly, surprising himself by speaking, my son is 12. The guard waited, sensing there was more coming. He asked me why we were visiting England. I told him we were going to see how the other half lives, see what we'd be like if we hadn't won the revolution. Brad's voice was barely above a whisper now. I told him it would be educational, seeing a country that used to matter. The admission hung in the air like smoke, visible and poisonous and impossible to take back. And what will you tell him now? The guard asked. Brad looked down at his hands, at the USA #1 shirt that suddenly felt like a costume, at the ground that had absorbed the blood of better men than he would ever be. When he looked up again, his eyes held something they hadn't held before the beginning of understanding. I don't know, he said. I honestly don't know. The American veteran stepped forward, his weathered hand extended toward Brad. Start by learning your own history, son. Start by understanding what your country used to mean to the world. What it could mean again if people like you remembered what it cost. Brad shook the old man's hand, feeling the calluses and scars of someone who had earned the right to speak about sacrifice. I was at Normandy, the veteran said quietly. Omaha Beach. I was 19 years old, scared out of my mind, throwing up in a landing craft while the Navy shelled the cliffs. You know what kept me going? The knowledge that I was part of something bigger than myself. Something worth dying for. He paused, his eyes growing distant, as he remembered something Brad could never fully understand. I fought alongside British commandos, Canadian paratroopers, Free French resistance fighters. We bled together, died together, won together. We were Americans, but we were more than that. We were part of something that mattered. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the confrontation having reached its natural conclusion. But many lingered, sensing that they had witnessed something significant, something that would stay with them long after they left the Tower of London. Sarah approached Brad cautiously, her hand touching his arm with tentative concern. Are you okay? She asked. Brad looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't noticed before. Shame. She was ashamed of him, ashamed of what he had become, ashamed of how he had represented their country and their family. No, he said, quietly, I'm not okay. I don't think I've been okay for a long time. The guard had resumed his post, standing at attention as if the confrontation had never happened. But something had changed in the air around him, something that spoke of respect earned and lessons taught. A young British woman approached Brad hesitantly. Excuse me, she said, her accent crisp and polite, but I wanted to thank you. Brad looked at her with confusion. Thank me? For what? For learning, she said simply. For being willing to see something different than what you came here to see. It gives me hope that not all Americans have forgotten what your country used to stand for. The words were kind, but they cut deep. Used to stand for. Past tense. The implication was clear. America had lost something, and people like Brad were the reason why. As the morning progressed, the normal rhythm of the tower resumed. Tours began. Guides shared their carefully rehearsed histories. Children asked questions about executions and ghosts and crown jewels. But for Brad, the ancient stones seemed to whisper different stories, now stories of men who had stood watch, who had held the line, who had paid prices he was only beginning to understand. He found himself reading the plaques with new eyes, seeing beyond the dates and names to the human cost behind them. Every memorial represented someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother who had believed in something worth dying for. The tour guide, a cheerful woman in her 50s, was explaining the history of the yeoman warders to a group of tourists. They're all military veterans, she was saying, with at least 22 years of service. They've earned their place here through distinguished service to crown and country. Brad listened with attention he had never given to such explanations before. 22 years minimum. The guard who had confronted him had given more than 2 decades of his life to service, had earned his scars and his position through sacrifice. Brad was only beginning to comprehend that as the day wore on. Brad found himself staying close to the White Tower, watching the guard from a respectful distance. He observed how other visitors approached the reverence of most, the occasional disrespect of a few, and how the guard maintained his dignity and composure regardless of how he was treated. Near closing time, as the crowds thinned and the shadows grew long, Brad approached the guard one final time. He didn't speak immediately, simply stood at a respectful distance, waiting. Finally, the guard's eyes moved to meet his. "I owe you an apology," Brad said quietly. "Not just for today, but for everything I represent, for forgetting what my grandfather fought for raising my son to think America's greatness comes from putting other people down instead of lifting them up." The guard listened without responding, his expression neutral but not unkind. "I don't know how to fix it," Brad continued. "I don't know how to become the kind of American my grandfather would have been proud of. But I want to learn. I want to do better." For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, separated by an ocean of difference but connected by a thin thread of mutual understanding. "Then learn," the guard said finally. "Learn your history. Learn what your country accomplished when it remembered what it stood for. Learn what sacrifice means, what honor costs, what duty requires, and teach your son to be better than you were." Today, as Brad walked away from the Tower of London that evening, his USA #1 shirt felt heavy with the weight of unearned pride. But for the first time in years, he also felt something else, the possibility of becoming worthy of the country whose name he wore across his chest. The ancient stones held their secrets close, but they had given up one truth to a man who needed to hear it: that greatness isn't proclaimed, it's proven. One choice at a time, one generation at a time, one moment of courage or cowardice at a time. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get the chance to choose again.